Okay.
All right, so this is the second meeting for our KubeVirt version 1 planning. Or I guess it was 2 weeks ago, we got pretty far down the list. What we're doing is we're looking at this list of items in this document, trying to make a decision about what needs to make it into version 1 and what can be cut or modified or changed. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we got to persistent container disk volumes, and we probably spent way too long talking about this. What we arrived at is we're unsure if how we're going to implement persistent container disk volumes, whether it's going to be backed by a QCal delta volume, or if we do some sort of importing the container disk to a PVC directly, or what's going to happen. The thing that we did arrive on is that we need some sort of persistent container disks or some sort of persistent storage, this kind of native to KubeVirt that people can use, that's kind of like easy mode. So when we look at our tutorials and people are wanting to start their first virtual machine, container disk is a really easy way to import an image, and we should have some sort of offering that allows them to do that in a persistent way. So we don't have to necessarily go down that. We can take that offline and talk about exactly how we implement that. But we decided that that would be useful, and that is something once lots of new eyes arrive on the project when we announce that we're version 1, we want that to be something that people can use. So moving on, the next topic would be to whether or not we need to establish this kind of predictable community release and support patterns. What we have today is release cadence that happens monthly, where we're just going to cut a new release every month, and we're doing that regardless of trying to time features or anything like that. It just happens the first of the month, and eventually, if no blockers occur within 5 business days, we just cut the release. This topic is about how do we support these releases, these stable releases, after they've been cut. So do we need to come up with some sort of policy about how backports, feature fixes or regression fixes or things like that occur, and for how long they occur? I'll just throw it out there. What are some people's thoughts?
I personally think it's long overdue that we add something like this. I had multiple occasions where I had users which required a fix, and it wasn't absolutely clear where to backport it or just to wait for the next release.
Yeah, it makes sense. How long do you think it would make sense to support, since we're on a monthly cadence, we're having tons and tons of releases, 12 a year. So how far back do we want to backport things, and for how long?
Also, I mean, do we want to backport to every release or in that time frame, or just specific ones out of these?
Right, exactly. I guess for the purpose of this meetings, do we agree that we need to establish a policy for backports and have that established before version 1? Maybe that's all we really need to decide today. Is that important enough for us to have that and have it in place and document where people understand kind of the community support that they're going to get? Or is what we have today with just the kind of monthly releases and the expectation that you should continue to update and there's no necessarily consistent backporting? Is that good enough? I can't. What do you think?
So my opinion really is it depends on how many releases we want to backport or how often that happens, because if we only backport to specific branches and also do a slow release there, then it's probably not much difference to just go to the next monthly release. That's a little bit unclear to me.
Yeah.
But I really think like it should be resolved for V1. like to that a user can clearly go here to our project and say, okay, here I can get a back when I'm on that version, I can get a backport. Until then, I can request it. Yeah, I mean, it could still be denied for whatever reasons, but in principle, this is how I can get a backport, and this is where I have to definitely update. This expectation should somehow be met, yes.
Was there a comment? Sounded like somebody else was about to jump in. Okay. So what I'm getting out of this is, yes, we need to probably have this discussion, and what we have today at least needs to be solidified a little bit better about how we're supporting these releases that we're cutting every month.
Yeah, and even if it would just be that we don't, I mean, if we release fast enough, it might, in theory, even be reasonable to not backport.
Yeah, okay, but we just need a policy.
Yeah,
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I think we can move on. All right, this one's kind of controversial, perhaps. So we have this bridge network binding mode today that's not completely stable, but it's the best thing that we have, or it's the only thing that we have that directly allows the pod's IP address to be visible within the host. So, within the guest. So when the guest virtual machine comes online and you look at what IP address is assigned internally, it's going to match the pod IP address with bridge mode. We need, that's a pretty important feature for a lot of reasons. That's how most cloud providers work. So when you look at things like clustering, it's pretty common expectation that the IP address is visible in the guest is the one that other guests within the cluster can contact that node at. So I think we need this. Do we have anyone from this kind of, is Petter on here?
Yeah, I'm here.
What are your thoughts here? Can we go with that? We had this solution perhaps with NAT that would be passing the IP address directly to the host. Does that look feasible for version 1?
Yeah, so I mean, for the version 1, there is no controversy that we cannot keep the bridge in the way it is, for sure. Like I personally don't feel comfortable supporting bridge as the default due to all its issues that it has. So for the options we have to implement it, one of them was the DC, the other maybe just using the same mechanism we have for Masquerade, but instead of having some random virt IP inside the guest, we will just give it the external IP. So then even though it does not, even though it still has NAT involved, it satisfies the requirement to have end-to-end connectivity over the IP, and the source knows its IP. So I think that both options would be feasible. We just need to figure out which one would be easier to support and make more, like cover more scenarios. So overall, I think this is something we want in V1.
Okay, and the time frame for this. So we're kind of loosely talking about when KubeVirt version 1 happens, but I'm hoping this year. Do you see that that's possible for us to get this, some sort of solution in before the end of the year?
Like the optimistic side of me wants to say yes. So I think we would be able to get like at least a POC or something like before the end of the year. But talking about the deadline, and this is a side step, we still want the requirement for security, and I don't see that one coming before the end of the year. So it is kind of on the edge. I cannot commit to have this implemented by the end of the year, but it's like semi-realistic. Does it help in any way?
Well, when you've looked at these different options, how confident are you that we have an option other than bridge that for sure we can implement?
So if we are talking about the currently suggested options, the TC and the IP tables.
Yep.
For TC, we don't have any TC code in KubeVirt now. And from my past experience, working with TC can be troublesome at times because it has a lot of options. It's not as simple to debug and all this. But I mean, it's still a feasible option, I guess. But I cannot give you an ETA on this because I can't really imagine what would be all the parts involved in that. For IP tables, though, we already have a pretty similar mechanism, for the masquerade binding, where the internal IP is some link local IP address different from the external one. So there, the question would be, what happens if we set the internal one to be the same as the external? Would it be something that IP tables or NF tables eventually can handle? So,
okay. So there's unknowns on both sides, I'm getting. So we haven't proven end-to-end either of these, even in a proof of concept fashion.
Yes. That being said, for POC, the changes should be pretty self-contained. It wouldn't be affecting the whole KubeVirt code base. It should be pretty limited to one module, say. So it should not be too difficult to POC that.
Okay. I see some risk there, but we'll, all right. So I think we've established that we need to replace the bridge network binding, and how we get there is the unknown. But we have some ideas. All right.
Yeah. I have one question for this one, and so I want us to set the expectation for the final solution for this binding, because with bridge now, we basically extend the L2 network from the pod all the way to the guest. So if somebody wants to send a broadcast, it would arrive to the host at least. But then the question is what the SDN plugin is doing with that traffic. With the IP table solution, it may not be the same thing, because there we have NAT that does one-to-one translation. So there is an edge between the two networks. So I guess the question is, do we just want to support the scenario where the source IP is or the internal IP is the same one as the external one? Or do we expect more from it? Do we expect to really extend the layer 2 network there?
So I don't know if we need to consider. So you're saying that broadcast won't work, essentially. I think that's pretty common, is it not?
Yeah, and I mean, the broadcast wouldn't work. It wouldn't work usually even with pods, because you're depending on the SDN implementation, which can do anything. I mean, the only expectations you can put on it is that it connects all the endpoints and it gives them some specific IP. So saying this, I think that it's enough if we match the internal and external IP address. But if anybody knows a reason why we should do more than that, to really have L2 connection between the host and the guest, then please raise it, because that may just kick out the option with IP tables.
I have no absolute point to kick out IP tables. It's just like with TC, if it works, you could expect that that you're much closer to whatever the SDN supports, whereas with the other one, we are explicitly limiting us down. But I don't know how this plays out in reality. It's just a thought.
Yeah, but I cheer for the IP tables option, because that would mean that we basically ditch one of the binding options for the primary network, and we just have the single binding mechanism with two modes. Either we give the guest the link local IP or the external one. So that may, from the maintenance perspective, this should be easier to maintain. than the DC. But the DC has its own benefits.
So I'm
I
not
think
sure. I
that's-
mean, it's if we have tests for both, we see them breaking. I mean, it's okay. But yeah, maybe.
I don't like. We have like huge question marks around us. So I think that the only way to resolve this is to POC it then and see if it works or not.
I agree.
Okay, so we want this. We want a stable one-to-one mapping of the pod IP address and the guest IP address available for version 1. So I guess we can move on unless there's anything else we should talk about there.
Sounds good.
Okay. So the next one is decoupling cert rotation from the operator and making cert management manageable, like pluggable. This came from the community. It was something where people wanted to be able to manage their certs themselves without depending and relying on KubeVirt to do it for them. I don't know how important this one is. Roman, you might have the strongest opinion here.
So, yeah, let me put it this way. We have one certificate rotation strategy right now, and this is basically self-managed. As discussed with the people from the community which want that. We can extend it with as many other certificate strategies, custom, skipped, whatever, and people would be able to do whatever they want. It's just like even for, I mean, also what the community people want is not another completely thought through solution, which would be managed by another strategy. It would really be like probably its own sub-strategy or whatever. So I would have no issues supporting the entry points with extra rotation strategies, but where we don't manage any certificates, I'm just not sure how it will play out from the implementation side. But I don't think anything is speaking against adding a strategy which basically does nothing anytime if someone needs it and does that. That's what I can say.
So for the purposes of V1, the thing that I want to make sure is that we're going to be able to enable this kind of features or this kind of functionality for people without impacting backwards compatibility or anything like that. So it sounds like we would. It would just be the operator would have a mode that essentially is hands off of cert rotation. Is that accurate?
I would not say that about GuessFi say that they can do this change without connectivity downtime for a brief period, but that they could change it on the fly, maybe. Does that answer what you said, or is that resonating with what you're saying?
I think so. Do you think anyone would approach KubeVirt and be concerned about not being able to tie into the cert rotation themselves easily when we go version 1? Do you think that's going to be perceived as a problem, I guess?
So my main issue is there are many ways on how certificates can provide it. I have no idea right now. I mean, we could add, if we think it's so important, we could definitely add a skip policy and make certificate places configurable or something, or not even that, just a real skip, and make clear how one can point to certificates and they can then just patch it out with their custom implementation with our patch mechanism or something. But I have really no better idea regarding to what else we should provide. I mean that even before the operator, it's probably more a matter, without changing the code, it's probably more a matter of luck if you could have used another certificate across the board than what we just created dynamically before.
It's like this to me. This sounds like some like a new feature that would arrive, like say in 1.1 or 1.2, whatever. But like I wouldn't. installing V1 of KubeVirt, I wouldn't consider this feature a must-have personally, and I don't run any like clusters myself, so I'm not in the best position to say if there are people out there wanting it or not. But if I see a feature set of V1, I wouldn't necessarily care about this feature to be like on the top of the list. To me, it sounds like something extra that, and if we can spend the time working on a different feature to make V1 like just install it and use it, and it will be great. It's documented. Like I would invest energy there rather than in extensions.
Okay. I think you're right. So my opinion is I don't see a large portion of people approaching KubeVirt caring about this. That's what I was trying to get at. And I don't think that it's going to be something that most people worry about. I know that sometimes when people put things in production, they want to have fine granular control over how certs are distributed and things like that. Maybe that's post version or after version 1. We can approach that.
It's just, I would not know on what to decide. There are a few standard ways, like Cert Manager, like CSRs, and then we have our custom one. And then there are people which do it completely differently, and which out of those are the most important or need to be there to be taken serious, I don't know.
Got it. Okay, I moved it. It's off the list. So we had this control plane patching, which actually already got implemented. So remove that one. I don't think this one's going to be much discussion. I think we need to review and revise the user guide, especially just kind of the first approach of installation and running your first virtual machine. The thing that I see most people complain about here is it's just not obvious. We aren't doing enough to guide people about what the right decisions are. So we list all the options they can use. Like, for example, with volumes, we have a whole user guide section on all the different types of volumes and things like that, but it's kind of overwhelming to the first user. I think it would be helpful for us to come up with kind of a streamlined user guide, and then separate the basics from the advanced, or something like that. What do you all perceive about our user guide here?
I'd like to see some use cases added to why we want to pick one option over another.
Makes sense.
I think we have a very similar issue on the networking documentation, where it's more, it looks more like API documentation with like extra text on top of it. It lists all the options that you can use, but it's not like really a user guide with user stories. If you want to do this, then this is the best YAML you can create to get what you need.
Right, I get that as well. So if people want to just understand our API, we have auto-generated logic for that, where they can go in and look at like all the structs and all of that. The user guide should be focused on here's what to do and here's why. Like, so the user stories.
From my perspective, it needs examples which you can copy paste. Going at
Yeah.
API docs is good for advanced things. So, for instance, I know that I just listed all options on the volume types, for instance, but there are also always copy-paste examples for each one and so on. So, yeah. Otherwise, people are completely lost in the API docs.
Okay.
There is another point which I find crucial, which we did not do yet, and this is in GCS or somewhere. Releasing a file which just contains the latest release of KubeVirt. So when I go to our docs, there is this thing like you can get our YAMLs from the GitHub release page and replace this string with the latest version thing. And then most of the time I have an example with an outdated version there. So it should really be just something like kubectl apply and this GCS file which points to the latest version or something.
Yep. Self-explanatory. Okay. Anything else here? I think we're in agreement that so there's going to be eyes on us when KubeVirt version 1 comes out, and this is going to be kind of the entry point for people. So we want to make sure, that it's the most approachable entry point that they'll have.
I think we need to 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 explain in details with examples, like you said, how to connect to VMs that you create from outside the cluster. Me myself, when I started to work on this project, it was hard. It wasn't so straightforward to understand it, and from time to time I see it on the authorization channel. Question like how to connect, how to explore.
Yes. Yeah.
So you mean something like SSH ingress, or perhaps Windows Remote Desktop ingress from outside the cluster into the cluster?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'll add that.
I would add all kinds of different ways to connect inside the cluster, even kubectl, port forward. If we can, something like load balancer or whatever, all these things. We get these questions over and over, and it's also for us a little bit like, yeah, you can try out this or that, but if we could just point to clear examples or more clear examples, it's preferable.
Yeah, you have a good point, Roman, here. I mean, like there are some questions that are really appearing again and again, but for myself, I cannot really say I'm like, if I see it for the first time, I'm not creating a user story. So maybe getting better in this workflow would be worth it. And we can also identify the user stories that we really need by doing this. I'm not sure how to implement this, like other than just not being so lazy and doing it. Maybe we can,
coming up with an entry point where we collect something like this. At least we will see how it goes or how lazy we are, but at least having a place where we can put them, where we agreed on, might help. Who we want.
Okay, makes sense. Anything else for the user guide before we move on?
Hey, David, I have a bullet point a little further down, about 5 bullet points down.
Documentation?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
Yeah, I talk about some user guide stuff down in here. So I was concerned that docs are spread out between the /docs directory and under KubeVirt repo. And I'm not sure how those docs either synchronize with user guide docs or supplement them or what. Seems like we need to review those pages and integrate them into user guide. I checked out other projects like Kubernetes, and they do have a /docs directory, but it doesn't contain anything. So they're pretty strict on keeping all docs in a docs repo.
That's a great point. I don't know if I could tell you what belongs in docs and what belongs in the user guide. At one point, we were considering docs, I believe, to be kind of developer focused, but that's definitely not the case entirely. Would it make sense for us to get rid of docs at this point and point everything? I don't
think we need to get rid of them. I think we just need to review them and migrate them and then get rid of them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And most of it is completely outdated.
Yeah.
That's really what I was worried about, is somebody cloning the repo and then getting in there and getting out-of-date information.
Oh, the issue is that if we have some documentation for like how to spin up your cluster and how to use things in KubeVirt, if it is under KubeVirt/KubeVirt, then you change the make target, you set for all the occurrences of it, and you see it in the documentation directory. If we move it as it is now to user guide, then it will get outdated, and like there will be like the bar to keep it up to date would be even higher. Can we maybe just keep documentation for development under KubeVirt/KubeVirt and somehow generate it as a part of the user guide so it stays up to date and it's close to the source?
I'm not sure if the developer things should be on KubeVirt.io. I mean, it says like it talks about make targets and so on, and they really change from commit to commit. That should really be in the KubeVirt, and I don't think it makes much sense to have it in KubeVirt.io.
Okay, so we are not killing this directory, or at least not the whole thing.
Yeah.
So we need to clean up this docs directory. We need to pull out anything that I think is user-centric and move that to the user guide, or delete it and make sure that the user guide covers it. So, and then what? The docs is just, what do we use docs for at that point?
What we have in there, which is kind of bad, is, I mean, not necessarily bad, but there, as I said, we started a little bit with developer-focused introductions on how KubeVirt is designed and everything. But and we tried to keep it kind of brief, but still no one is maintaining it. It just gets outdated, and the code is the only way where it is how it is. So these kind of documents should probably go away. They were not really helpful.
I can, like for networking, we did a revamp of that section like this spring, I think. And the reason was that it was kind of hard to get the whole picture of the bindings and like the way how the networking API is implemented and how it works. So we spent some time documenting it under docs. And that one I can tell is pretty up to date, and it is helpful for people that are just coming to KubeVirt and to the network part of things.
Okay. And I don't know. It's hard to keep these things updated. Pretty much impossible over the whole project. So I'm unsure what to do.
Let's make it better than it is now. I think we can agree. We can agree on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like maybe the split should be, if it's something that like a user should do, then it should be nice and neat under user guide, and they should not be able to find any documentation for that under KubeVirt, because like it's not necessarily up to date. For the documentation for development, like the chances are that the people who read it were pointed to it and are not completely new to KubeVirt, maybe. So like being a little out of date there wouldn't be that big of an issue, because there is not this first impression aspect in it. I'm just really protective about the documentation for networking. That's it.
Okay.
So then Pep and I were also contemplating the usefulness of Doxify JS as a Markdown engine for user guide. We've been finding a lot of problems with linking between blog pages and general pages from website to user guide. We've mitigated some of the 404 page issues, but there's still issues with getting at the header elements, and there's over 300 of those links, and we don't have tooling to verify.
Chris, sorry to interrupt, but I think this is kind of an implementation detail, and for in the context of the V1 planning discussion, I think maybe it does not belong here. I mean, the thing is that, well, right now there are technical issues with the documentation beyond the structural or conceptual or whatever, but those technical issues we have to fix them anyway, regardless of P1 or not. Make sense?
Sure.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well. And whatever, I don't think anyone's really passionate about whatever technology we use to make our user guide. The only thing that I think a lot of us care about is a search bar. That's been really
Yeah.
handy, just to be able to quickly, like if I want to type in container disk, then I'm going to get a bunch of links of where that's referenced. So things like that are helpful. But as long as we have those tools, who cares?
A good search helps with many issues in a guide in general to overcome them.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
Teresa's
So that's
point.
really good to
however,
know.
Yeah, but getting this had, it has implied having, other issues. So we need to, let's say, okay, needs a search bar is the minimum requirement, and then the details.
It should work too. Maybe we should add that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, I think we can move on. Yeah, we got a few more minutes. Let's just try to get, I think these last ones are pretty easy. So replacing Virt handler's domain notify server. This is kind of an implementation weak point for us. What do you think, Roman? Because this is something we go back and forth on. How important is this for V1? Does it even matter for V1?
I think not necessarily. It's just for KubeVirt very important because we have a lot of dirty legacy attempts here, and we just need one clear, maintainable interface. And I think we have now enough experience to make that, at least to make it much better than it is right now, so that we can live very long with it without changing it. So it's important, but I'm not sure if it's. I'm a little bit concerned about telling people we want, and then we detect issues with our different flows. But they would probably be mostly just experience it when updating from older versions.
Yeah, we're going to have to make this backwards compatible regardless. So I'm not terribly worried about it.
What I would just want is when they are on V1 and when they start using KubeVirt with V1, it would be great if we have already a mechanism in place where, despite all our legacy issues which we support for other people which are long on board, that they don't have to suffer due to these two. That's, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's more that we have to suffer because we'd have to maintain. We'd have a longer duration where we can't deprecate something.
So I would say it's great if we bring it in, but I wouldn't say it's mandatory.
Yeah. All right, Virt launcher updates. So right now, when we do an update of our control plane, so if you do a KubeVirt update with the operator, you're going to get new everything except for the components that are running within the virtual machine workload itself. So Virt launcher, libvirt, QEMU, and things like that. Is this something we need to address for version 1?
I personally think it's important that we make very clear that this is not happening. So if you're updating KubeVirt because of, I don't know, QEMU, KVM, libvirt, whatever CVEs, it needs to be clear for you that you also have to cycle the VMs. I think that is the more important part.
Should we support a automated mechanism to force cycle these virtual machines? Is there something we can do to help people, I guess, out of the gate here?
Automating that is very easy. The question is, how do we automate it that it fits the needs for most people which are updating? I guess it might make sense to have a few examples on how to automate it, to illustrate fitting solutions. But I have the feeling that we can only properly provide an automated solution when we say this is how you have to update them. And I didn't see that happening yet, or that we say you need to update. We were always going the other direction. We were saying, no, we make everything that you don't have to update, that you can really have this 1 year uptime in theory. If we say that's what we support next KubeVirt. Even if you don't even if you can't migrate the VM. I mean, we have to make clear here what we support here, I guess, before we can automate the VM restarts, which is basically what you need to do today.
if we focus the V1 on the like first impression for new users, I mean, this is something that would bother them after a month when they need to upgrade, but not before that. I just trying to give you a point why we maybe should not include it necessarily.
So I think I agree. I don't think we need the live updates right now. It's going to come eventually. I think at the minimum, what we need is in our advanced documentation around updates to document what's going on and how to, I guess, how to update, kind of forcibly update your workloads by either live migrating or restarting them. And maybe we can have some automation around that.
And it might also be nice to have some warning features. I'm not sure if, I think that came up a few times in other contexts, like Kubernetes event warning, which says, yeah, we know which libvirt and QEMU versions are in there, right? If there would be a way to distribute CVEs with QEMU libvirt version or something, we could create an update then events which say this is affected by CVE, please reboot the VM or whatever. All kinds of things are possible. It's just automatic restarting for the user is hard at this stage, I think, for us, because we don't know when to do it.
Okay, so there's some low effort things we can do to improve the situation. The live updating of the Virt launcher pods, which is it's kind of a crazy thing we're looking at. I don't think that's going to make it for version 1 or even needs to make it. Here's another one, a depreciation policy. This is something so it's similar to the Kubernetes deprecation.
That's roughly a year or something, right? To sum it up.
I think that's fair. I think that falls under our predictability of community release and support patterns. Does anyone disagree with that?
Nope.
Okay. And the last one here is a templating mechanism for virtual machines. So this is something we've been discussing, perhaps a way to abstract away some of the API complexities and just like an easy mode for virtual machines. OpenShift has something kind of like this that CMV uses, where they provide a template and then somebody can fill out just a couple of variables, like how much CPU memory and the name of the virtual machine and perhaps the root disk. So with 4 things, then they get their virtual machine. And they didn't have to know about how to structure their YAML and all these kind of interdependency relationships where volumes matches disks and things like that. Do we need something like that? And would that make sense as an entry point that people should be using when they first approach the project?
I think that for the first approach, like the first VM you create is pretty easy and it's simple on its own. But when things get more complicated, like recently we are working on like DPDK in guest DPDK support, and there you need to pass like a couple of options that are not really clear. Like you wouldn't come up with it yourself. You would need to read the user guide, or I don't know what would be another option. So for use cases like this, templates may be really useful. But talking about the first impression again, I think that the VM, like the basic one, is like really straightforward as it is.
Okay, so this would be an advanced sort of thing for people that have very specific types of workloads, like the telco thing that you mentioned. And I think, would Windows fall under this as well? Are there things about Windows workloads that require tunings that might not be obvious? I guess what I'm hinting at is, do we have any sort of basic use cases where it's going to require tunings that are not obvious to people? I'm unaware of any, but that's the kind of thing that would make me lean towards needing something like this templating. But if we don't, and it's really just the simplest use case that we have in our examples, where you just add a root disk and assign that to a disk in the spec and we're done, then that's not that big of a deal.
I think for Windows disks, it's always for Windows VMs, it's a huge issue to configure them correctly. So their advice is really great. I've seen countless discussions where people even have issues like, "Hey, my Windows VM needs 30 minutes to boot up," and then someone tells him to add these 15 Hyper-V flags, and then it's, "Hey, yeah, now it works normally, right?" I mean, I don't know how.
That's not great.
I believe this is definitely useful, but in terms of a requirement for V1, I'm not so sure. Maybe that's something that for V1 can be, known examples, or like for Windows, like, well, we are expanding the user guide. Maybe we can have a section about this, like recommendations for Windows VMs or something like that, and basically document it. And in terms of having this functionality as a requirement, maybe not.
And as a new user, I don't find that templating mechanism to be useful or expediting to bring up virtual machines.
It also adds another object that you need to learn about before you get into KubeVirt. So instead of VM and VMI, you would also need to figure out what the heck is a VM template, right? And then.
Okay, I think I agree. All right, so at the minimum, we just need to improve. Again, it's going back to our user guide, improving some common examples for use cases that require some more advanced tunings like Windows. All right, I can clean this up. Are there any other items to this list that we didn't cover that you think we should before we close out?
May I speak? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm from Samsung, and we're reviewing KubeVirt for potential usages. I realized I couldn't find any wording where the schedule is. I realize schedule is a sensitive topic, but and I also know that OpenShift is using KubeVirt in their commercial OpenShift, but would it be safe to say that KubeVirt 1.0 would come out like late fall next year?
I'm hoping that we get KubeVirt version 1 out this year. Yeah, that's the hope. So what you're asking for is a roadmap, and we don't have one. You're right. So part of this meeting is to establish our version 1 roadmap, and essentially we're trying to decide on the items that are needed for it, and then we can begin the actual planning. I'm optimistic that we can get this out in a year. I could be wrong, and it could be that once we kind of spec out and itemize all these things and look at it after it's all kind of created into issues and things like that, we see that it's not possible. I think you're right that we need to start publicizing our roadmap and make that something that's available to people when they approach the project as a first-time contributor, or if they're interested in the project, understanding what's coming in the next few months and things like that. We don't do a good job at that at all right now. It's all just kind of things just kind of land and they appear, and there's no advanced warning necessarily of what's in motion.
Okay, so you're hoping to get 1.0 out end of this year, and is that correct?
That's the goal. Yeah. I think one of the things that I was about to bring up, if we still had time, is how do we track these things? So when we look down at publishing our roadmap here, what tools should we begin using to do this? Should we use like a GitHub milestone and assign issues to that milestone so we can kind of see everything that falls under version 1 that we've, but it also spans multiple projects as well. If we're looking at KubeVirt and GitHub, or the KubeVirt and then the user guide, these things are all kind of contributing to this roadmap, but they're not under the same repo. Should this be a document? How can we track this? Does anyone have any thoughts?
Maybe a GitHub project could help. I've seen other projects do that. Like, I think this could work, and you can point to multiple. You can include items and reference items from different repos in the same work, so that could. And it's easy to link to and find, and well, it's also easy to maintain in the sense that it's there in GitHub and it's not a separate document or something. So, and it's easier to keep up to date. And well, just an idea. I think it could work.
Okay.
I realized that feature freeze for 1.0 and stability are actually parallel items, especially from a production center where I'm from. Instead of, we're always wondering when the first stage will be ready for the business units to have their eyeballs on this. And I realized that the business units are more sensitive towards stability than rather having many multiple features. Could there possibly be like a topic on stability? I realize like Linux has like odd or even versions for stable versions and feature-rich versions in that sense.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. You're kind of asking for a, I believe the topic is kind of broaching like an LTS release or something like that, like a longer support. I don't know if we're ready to consider something that supported kind of long-term yet in the community. Is that, did I read that into what you're saying correctly?
Yes, something stable enough so that they can start adding their own software onto it, and something just so they don't suddenly get hit by a certain issue that they'll have to like deep dive into the source code too. So like if there's something solid enough so that they can work off.
That's interesting. And when you talk about working off of, are you meaning contributing or actually modifying the code, or are you talking about using stable, or are you talking about using defined interfaces like the API or some sort of hooks or things like that?
The culture is so much that Samsung has a hard time understanding the source code, but they have enough manpower to add other features that they need. So pretty much works. Samsung is still like a factory like culture where like you get one part from one assembly line, then other stuff gets added on the other assembly line. So there's pretty much like a trust culture where if you get one block, that should be solid. Then you add another block, that should be solid. So the whole chain of production is waiting for KubeVirt to be in a certain solid state or stable state so that they can start add other stuff like UI, like PVCs or other stuff, or they would add, it would be integrated into their firewall systems and all that. But they would have to wait at a certain stage where it would be stable enough to just see it as a black box.
I see. So as long as you're treating KubeVirt as it's a black box, and you're using well-defined APIs that we export. So like our virtual machine API and things like that. By version 1, I would expect all that to be stable. I would honestly expect it to be stable today. It's called our V1 Alpha API, but the expectation is that that gets upgraded to version 1 and with essentially just an alias. So it becomes version 1, what we have today. But I think everyone would feel more comfortable once it actually is called version 1, because that gives a much stronger guarantee that we are officially committed to this. I'm not sure when you talk about stable releases, as in like the code doesn't change and things like that.
No, not in that sense. Just like, imagine like if you use a Samsung phone, you realize that there's not many bugs in it compared to other phones in the market. In that sense, even though it's not as feature rich as the other phones.
We are, at least the community is favoring release often and release early. We have a CI test suite that's meant to keep us as stable as possible. And we're really leveraging this as much as possible to ensure that we don't introduce regressions and things like that. And that is what we're using to kind of allow our velocity of development to continue moving forward without having to have like a long-term support release. So the expectation is that even master branch remains as stable as possible. I know that doesn't probably feel comforting, though, for somebody who's basing their production off something like this. I'm not sure if we're to the point where we can do an LTS. Like, okay, if we did an LTS release, what's the duration that you would expect it to last for?
Yeah, they would last for. They wouldn't mind the feature changes, but it's more of and they wouldn't mind the API changes, but it's always about, because as you know, production, there's so many things that can go wrong. They're just worried about how much things like incidents that might happen. That's their only perspective, and the managers are asking me, so how stable is it? I'm in the R&D department right now, so can we give it to our business unit? When do you think is even? I won't use the word political, but it is politically safe enough to have BUs have eyeballs on this.
Yeah, so with an open source project, I think that it's really the community tells us when it's stable enough. We can say whatever we want as developers. We can call it version 1 today and say that it's ready, but the reality is it's not ready until people are using it in production and tell us that it's ready. So we expect, you all have to tell us that it's ready.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've been asked to. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead. I'll comment later. Okay.
So another parallel mission I was asked to was find other companies that actually use this and their experience with how stable it is. It's hard to find companies that actually have used this in a more serious production environment yet, except for OpenShift.
Well, there are. I am uncertain on what I can publicly say in this forum. They're in the community. Maybe that's something you could bring up on the mailing list and see if anyone comes forward.
Yeah, good idea. I should ask that openly.
Yeah, so I don't want to out anyone who I'm not sure has publicly said that they're using KubeVirt, unless they want to do that. But I will say that people are using it in production today. In fact, they were using it last year in production. I was very surprised. So I did a presentation at KubeCon, and I had talks with people afterwards, and it was surprising to hear, even at that point, how many people were using it in a production setting.
Okay, that's great. That's very helpful news.
Yeah, just a quick note. What I wanted to actually ask if this item here that we discussed about the having a predictable, well, a documented and predictable support pattern cycle, would that help to to meet your goals? In the sense that
that's the thing about support is usually it's hard to explain, but assembly line culture, it's like you get one block and the block gets turned over to the next block. Interactive discussions are very difficult to have in this like factory-like environment. So, but I understand what you're coming at, and usually what international companies, they sell their alpha versions and they give beta versions to their customers, and they have like technical support to stabilize it. But if such a process is there, I think I can explain that to the managers.
Okay. Yeah, I was hoping that the predictable part of that item could be, comforting to management, maybe.
Yeah, how do you comfort your executives?
Yeah.
Okay. You see what I'm getting at, right?
Understood. Yeah. I understand. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Anything else we should
one
discuss?
question here now.
Oh, go ahead.
One question for Leslie. Would it help if we make it more publicly visible how much we test?
If it's testing, I realize I try to find some testing code, like acid test, but I guess it's hard to do that. Reference always helps. I mean, my managers keeps asking for reference. Someone recommended I read through the Reddit and try to find certain users of the Reddit, some users who actually use this, their experience. That also helps, and to actually use it. There's obviously financial interest in why the company would use KubeVirt over some other commercial VMs, but that's obviously there. But in the production year environment, all the managers are very conservative. They're risk wary.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right, so we're a little bit over. I think that wraps it up. I'll clean up this document a little bit, and we'll continue the rest of it on the mailing list, and I'll perhaps look into a GitHub project to kind of begin tracking some of this. Essentially, I'll come up with some way for us to clearly understand what our milestones are, what it's going to take to get to version 1, and we can begin at least. So that sets the goalpost for us, and we'll figure out how to piece all these items out to people and come up with a time frame later. Does that sound reasonable to everyone?
Sounds great.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks for joining. Sorry it went over a little bit. Great feedback. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you very much.